Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and we are here today with
Bethany C. Morrow. I'm the author of Cherish Farrah, as well as several other novels, but I think we're here today to talk about Cherish Farrah.
We are definitely here to talk about Cherish Farrah. It was such an interesting book. I really, really liked it. I wasn't really sure what I was getting myself into when I started reading it. And there are a lot of things I'd like to say, but I don't really want to say them because if people have not read the book yet, it might give a little too much away. But I certainly think people should read it. There's a lot of nuance within the story. One of the things I happen to like is I like to read horror. Mm-hmm. I like to read stories that involve relationships between female characters.
Yeah.
And sometimes those two things cross over really, really well. And this is also social horror, and it was just like trifecta perfect. So would you like to tell us a little bit about where this book came from?
Yeah, it's actually kind of difficult to talk about it because it's a spoiler in and of itself. As somebody who, again, this sort of the impetus to write this book was my agent asking for something, and like asking if I would be interested in, or saying rather she would be interested in something kind of specific from me. And initially I was like, no, thank you. And then I think I texted her probably within the next few minutes because I had actually a memory of a story from when I was a kid that always really fascinated me. And if you've read the book, that story is in the book. And the way that story could be used to as sort of a entry point into talking about modern day United States and the racial cast. And so that's really the beginning. And that in itself is like a twist. So it's a difficult book to talk about in terms of why would I write the book and what is the book about? It's easier, honestly, to talk about the characters and the story that you think you're reading before you know the real story, which of course, because it's what I call a late stage twist, you don't actually know the story that you're reading until the end, basically. And that's always really important when there is that sort of story. What's really important is giving the reader a story that they think is the real story.
Yeah, I will say it really just sort of smacked me in the face. And I was like, oh, okay. Because the thing that we're dancing around was something that I remember being exposed to when I was younger too, and that being something I always remembered, and then seeing it in this context, it was just so perfect. So let's talk about the characters and stop dancing around the story we're reading. We have two young Black women who are friends, but there are a lot of differences between the two of them and a lot of similarities.
I don't know how many similarities there genuinely are. It's a problem of being flattened by society, which happens always to especially racially marginalized people, is that you are flattened to fit the imagination of the power dominant demographic. And so you are one or the other side of a stereotype. And that, in my estimation, just depends on whether it's the quote unquote kind stereotype that comes from white liberalism, or whether it's the demonized stereotype that comes from just overt bigots. So interestingly, the thing that I would say is the most similar about Cherish and Farrah, which are the two main girls, and they're girls, they're teenagers, right? Even though it's an adult novel, these two characters are 17-year-old girls.
Right. I had to keep reminding myself that.
Well, the reason is because Farrah is your POV character, and she has a budding psychopathy. And so she's biologically a teenager, but she makes it pretty clear, and it's just a question of whether you believe her soon enough or not, that she is cosplaying a teenage girl. She does not have the same reflexes and reactions to things, and she's a lot more attentive in a way that is not just like, oh, you're so like critical, and you're such a, you have such a critical mind, you're such an analytical mind. It's like, no, but there's a reason. She's always strategizing. Her interest is in control, which is obviously her mantra throughout the book. And so that is her driving motivation in all things, is attaining and maintaining control. Dissimilarly, Cherish is, well, she's, as Farrah calls her, white girl spoiled. She is a transracial adoptee, which means that she's a Black girl, but her parents are white American. And they live in this country club community where she and Farrah are the only two Black girls. And so they're more than friends in a lot of ways. And in a lot of scary ways, they're more than friends, because they're more than friends. It's not that they always get along. It's not that they always are good to each other. It's that they cannot exist without each other, which is more of a dangerous dynamic than just genuinely being friends with someone, right? So there is an obsessive aspect to it also. And there, so that aspect of it is a result, that is a direct result, of course, of being the only two Black girls in this extremely white society. But Cherish is white girl spoiled, which means that despite the fact that her parents are these really, socially aware, white liberal, progressive, air quotes all over the place, people, they've made all of these decisions and this mindfulness about intentionally raising a protected Black girl, but always, of course, from a place of being white American. And white Americans have, as I believe James Baldwin said, it's sort of shocking that white Americans think they have so little to learn. Or actually, that was probably Martin Luther King Jr. who said that one. But the point is, we've all noticed it all of the time. It's always this sense of authority that comes from white supremacy itself that says, I know what's best. I know what's best for you. I know how to fill in these gaps. I know how to make your life better. It's the white savior narrative. But in this case, they've surrounded her with a Black pediatrician, with a Black hairstylist, and because they recognize things like medical racism and all that kind of stuff. But there is something that they can't be, which is Black American. There is something that they can't understand from their position of privilege. And that is the thing, that is the detriment to white supremacy and to privilege, is you literally don't have the capacity for this. You literally are intentionally, it's race is a social construct, and it's an intentional differentiation. It's an intentional divide, which is why it's so funny when Black people fighting for liberation are accused of being divisive. Like, bro, you made up race. The point of race was to divide. So saying I want to be liberated is not the divisive part. It's recognizing that the system as it exists will always be divisive, and it needs to be torn down. So Cherish, unfortunately, while having all of these appearances of having been raised with this mindfulness, has also been raised the way that you would raise an extremely affluent, an extremely privileged, and extremely sheltered rich white kid. The problem with that, of course, again, is that she's a Black girl. The world is not set up for that. I don't know if you remember this case from however many years ago, but this boy, actually, I don't even know how old he was. We always say boy, we always infantilize if it's a white child. He could have been 17, 18 years old. I have no idea. The point is, because he was driving, the point is that I believe he was drunk driving, and he ended up killing some pedestrians or whoever got in a car accident when they ended up dying. This boy, again, boy, air quotes, ends up not being held to the same consequences that any other person would have gotten. And the literal defense was affluenza.
Affluenza. Oh,
right. Yeah. Because he couldn't be expected to understand the consequences of his actions because he was so affluent, because he was so out of touch, because he was so, and so he's rewarded for this thing that you're trying to use it as a defense. Now you have it so good, quote unquote, you have it so, you so distance yourself from the reality of the rest of the world that you shouldn't even be held to the same consequence,
right?
Like
yeah.
You should never be held accountable. There's no way for you to be accountable. You're incapable of understanding the world. So what does that look like if that's a Black girl? And what Farrah knows is that because she's a Black girl, she can't exist outside of this family as she is. There is no world in which this is appropriate. There's no world in which this arrested development, this incompetence, this void is going to not be met with some sort of violent collision with the rest of the world. And so Farrah recognizes from a quite young age that Cherish has that void, and she knows that she uniquely can fill it because she's the only other Black girl. And she sets about doing that. That's the basis, honestly, of their earliest connection.
So Farrah used to live in the same neighborhood as Cherish, which is a big sort of thread going through her motivation and her, I guess, her need for control of Cherish specifically.
The interesting thing about them living in the same neighborhood, I want to make, and it's an observable. It's not like I'm like, oh, I'm being really thoughtful and making this like really obscure like statement that's difficult to read. It's just reality. It's observable reality. The United States has not, quote unquote, given Black people anything it can't take back. And that includes, because white supremacy makes whiteness the actual currency, the actual commodity. Becoming monetarily wealthy is not security for Black Americans, specifically for Black Americans, honestly, because it's most true. It appears to be most true for that demographic. And so they had been comparably affluent, but one thing goes wrong, and it's a domino effect because of a lack of generational wealth, which is a direct result of white supremacy, which is an engineered discrepancy in the United States. Her family falls through these tiers, falls through the stratosphere. And she's supposed to accept that everything's just going to be different now. Knowing that this doesn't happen to other people, knowing that other people don't have one mistake or one slip up or one bad thing happen and their whole fortune falls apart and their entire life falls apart, because she's lived in this country club community. She's talked about seeing people's parents be indicted and, watching all of these scandals unfold. And at the end of the day, the family is in the same position where they started, or relatively close. There are all of these safety nets. And that's how you know that something is institutional. And so she is really, the part where I feel like you can tell she's most a teenager is honestly the fact that she turns this anger toward her parents as in, fix this, when she should be able to recognize that there's a reason her parents specifically don't have the power to simply, quote unquote, fix this. But that is her, in her teenageness, which you rarely honestly see, that is her solution, is like, you need to make this right. And until such a time as they make it right, she is staying with Cherish's family, again, because this is the neighborhood she's from, this is the academy she's always gone to, and she wants to get control back over her life. And it's unacceptable that outside influences could so ravage her life. It's also one of the nuanced parts that isn't directly about race, right? Because if it were strictly about race, she would see this. She would see it for what it is and realize what's happening, and that actually that's a type of control you genuinely don't have. This is where her psychopathy comes in, which is, I don't care if nobody else has this. I don't care if this is usually about race. I will have control. I'm going to maintain control. And so it's not always a really straightforward story about like, oh, this is the consequences of our white supremacist society. It's also, and this particular girl, there's something else troubling about her.
Yeah, and you get some senses that, you know, her parents are aware of all of this. And I like that you say that that's like the one point where you realize that she's a teenager, because when you're reading it and the parents have their misgivings about, you know, how much time she wants to spend with Cherish's family and how much she feels like, you know, she just wants to be able to go back to this neighborhood, and this is, you know, how it's going to work, regardless of the fact that her mother seems to be aware, you know, there's something kind of scary about my kid.
Yeah.
She's also aware that this is her blind spot, so to speak, I guess, or, you know, this is, for lack of a better phrase, this is the point she's just not going to catch on to.
You see that in a really important conversation between Nicole Turner, which is Farrah's mother, and Farrah. And it's sort of after Farrah has manipulated, and honestly, again, in something that's way more nuanced than a 101 conversation about race, you see that Farrah herself really takes advantage of the situation that her parents are in. She takes advantage of the pain her parents are in, specifically Nicole, because it's Nicole who knows who Farrah is. It's Nicole who sees her. And in Farrah's mind, the only way, because of course, like many people with this type of psychopathy, her genuine belief is, I am the smartest person in the room. And therefore, if there's anyone else who sees me, clearly they have to be like me. They have to be the same as me. And so she thinks that her and her mom have always been in what she calls these war games. Her genuine belief is that she and her mom have been sparring for her entire life. It's up to the reader to determine how much of any of this is true, of anything that you learn, because the narrator, of course, is Farrah. And you do spend time with Nicole on the page. So it's like, what is true? Like, who is Nicole? And how do I get to the truth about who Nicole is when my entry point is Farrah? But Nicole basically is the only person who seems to understand what's actually happening. And even her, of course, she can't know specifics. She just knows what it feels like as a Black woman to have a warning in your spirit that's like, okay, we need to do something different. Like, something needs to stop. Even if I don't know, even if I can't put it into words, I know enough. Survival, you know, the necessity of survival in this world has taught me when something needs to stop. But Farrah's very good at what she does. So she basically, you know, when it actually comes head to head, Farrah ends up the victor, and is why the story gets to continue.
Yeah, I thought that it was really interesting, I guess, watching her play chess, and even with this, you know, thing that she couldn't really see happening, that her mother maybe not 100% knew what it was, but knew that there was, you know, something around the corner that was maybe a little bit more than Farrah could control. It was this really interesting game of chess, and then kind of trying to figure out exactly where this is going, and including especially when you talk about the two young men in their lives.
Right, which are sort of mirrors of, in a way, they are presented almost as mirrors of Cherish and Farrah. It's another transracial adoptee, Tariq, who was adopted by this very, very powerful judge, Leslie Campbell, and his best friend, who is, again, another Black American boy who, differently from Farrah, he's not from this echelon. He's not from this, from sort of this stratosphere that they're in. He actually came into their family through the juvenile court system. He was in danger of going to juvie. before Judge Campbell intervened. And so he has sort of been unofficially adopted into the Campbell home. And so there's this mirror sort of to Farrah and Cherish's situation. But there's a strange dynamic between Kelly, who again is the other outsider, and Farrah, and a need sort of for her. He's probably the least important person in the world to her. So she is sort of the reason that she's pretending to get along with Kelly, or rather to almost be hurt by Kelly, because Kelly seems to be a bully to her in particular, is because she knows that while Kelly himself doesn't matter, his relationship to both Tariq and Cherish, because Cherish is dating him, would put her in danger of being seen by Cherish and Tariq. And so the game that she plays with Kelly is that she takes on the role of victim. She allows people to think that Kelly is bullying her, and she's pretty much waiting for a moment when he falls from grace, or when they see him accurately, in which case she will be able to sort of unleash everything on him, because he will at that point be she is really classist and like, of course she's ingested the same messaging. We all ingest this this anti-Blackness, this white supremacist messaging, and you don't get away from that unscathed, regardless of what your actual identity is, if you constantly hear this messaging over and over. And so one of the things that you see with Farrah repeatedly is that she seems to take the same position as the state. She seems to treat people, or at least take advantage of the damage that comes from anti-Blackness or misogynoir, specifically when it comes to her mother. And so her complete disregard of Kelly comes from the fact that he's a street kid, that he's been in trouble with the law, blah, blah. There's no like deep interrogation of what does it mean if you're over criminalized, if you are literally chased by this system, as Black children are, as Black men specifically are. How seriously should I take the fact that you've quote unquote had run-ins with the law? Like, how is that a reflection on you if I know that the system is created to do this, to antagonize you constantly and to over criminalize you? And yet you don't see that. You don't see that critical analysis from Farrah. She decides that Kelly doesn't matter and that Kelly is a nobody. And she's basically biding her time, waiting to dispose of him.
And I thought it was really just interesting and well placed that Tariq's adopted father, and I suppose Kelly's surrogate or foster, was a judge.
Right.
I mean, that was really, Cherish's parents, they were obviously very wealthy, and, but like the fact that Judge Campbell was a judge.
Right.
Was just
we're talking about literal institutional power, right? Yeah. We're not, because it can be really easy for white Americans to look at their personal level of wealth or their personal experience and try to disprove an institutional oppression and racism and bigotry by saying, well, I personally didn't have any of. So I'm like, I want to talk about the fact that it doesn't matter if you personally, the degrees of separation to institutional power for white people are like one at most. Okay, so like Cherish's family doesn't quote unquote have the institution, the visible institutional power that the Campbells have, right? But these are their best friends, and what you see is that these families actually end up operating relatively the same way. They end up having in practice a very similar type of authority, a very similar ability, at least, to operate outside of the supposed the supposed rule of law or whatever. So I wanted to make sure that we were talking about specific and tangible and literal institutional power and systems that have been set up, that the distance that you have to go to employ these is not the same as the distance I would have to go to employ these. And could I possibly employ these? Right. This is why we say, like, when a random white person uses a racial slur against a Black person, we're not talking about our feelings being hurt. We're talking about a threat that says, I can make good on this threat if I want. It doesn't matter who the white person is in the United States. I can make good on this. Do you know why? Because if I call the police on you, we've seen this happening over the last couple of years with such a heightened, we just got the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, and the woman who is responsible for him being lynched is still alive, has never been arrested. She's never had any sort of accountability on a community level, on a communal level. She's never had any sort of accountability. I don't know what's happened in her personal life, but it can't be enough. And in the same year, we have all of these self-deputized people who are intentionally calling the police on Black Americans in any given situation where they don't get their way, with the understanding of how state violence happens to Black Americans, how a traffic stop ends up with a death, with a murder. Okay, so you're talking about this frequent understanding, admission of understanding through actions of an admission that we understand our position of power. I understand that I can uniquely wield this system against you. And I will do it if I just don't think you live here. If I just don't think if I lose something in a grocery store, I'm going to assume you stole it, and I can wield this system against you. The reason you don't see that happening with other people is because we have an understanding that our position in relation to the legal system, the penal system, is much more distant. I can't wield it against you because my demographic doesn't make up the seat of justice. My demographic doesn't make up the seat. We're not the judges. Overwhelmingly, it's disproportionate to our position and to our population, our actual representation in these spaces. And a lot of times when you see us in those spaces, it's because we have been indoctrinated and we will operate the same way, right? That's why you're saying like, oh, let's just get more Black cops and that'll somehow change. Well, we've seen that doesn't. So it was really important to demonstrate not just that there is a literal family in here who has this power, but that even the family that doesn't has a connection to an immediate sort of connection to this type of institutional power.
So the whole just way the book escalates, and I've seen it described as like a slow burn, but man, what a burn it was. Wow. Did you know that was the end point?
At some point I did, but not when I first started. I will tell you, when I first started writing this, I have a critique partner named Amy Suter Clark. She's also an author. She wrote Girl 11. And I send her, the way that I work, and the reason that I have probably so few CPs, I assume, is because I don't like finish a draft and like send it to people. I finish writing for the day and then I send it to you. Like, as soon as I'm done. That's always been the way it's been for me. When I was a teenager, my writing has always been a community affair. Like I would write a chapter and then my sisters would read it out loud. So it was always like an immediacy of feedback and critique and engagement and stuff. And so that's still really the way that I write. So whenever people talk about writing being solitary, I'm like, I don't know her. I don't know about solitary writing. So anyway, I would send her these chunks and always, because I pretty much wrote the first 50,000 words just writing it, which was very weird for me. I wasn't confused while I was writing. This is the weird part. I wasn't confused while I was writing. I was always confused right after I stopped writing. Almost like as soon as I sort of stopped being possessed by Farrah, I would be like, what is this? What am I writing? Like, so I would email her these chunks and the subject header would be like, what's happening? Like, why is this happening? What is this story? And so I knew what the twist was. Because that's what prompted me to start writing it. But I really didn't know any major moment. I knew that was going to be revealed at some point, but I didn't know any major moment. And I certainly didn't know what actually happens at the end. So it was an adventure to write, because there was some point where we sold it on partial. We sold the book before it was finished. And so I wrote, for the first time, like a really specific synopsis. And so obviously when I wrote the synopsis, I knew what happened at the end. But when I was writing the synopsis, I remember just like having goosebumps, like, oh my gosh, this is really happening. But it was a really interesting experience, because it's so unlike any writing experience I've had before.
It was very much unlike any reading experience I've had before. Right. It was just wild. This was one of the ones that I just really sat down with. And it's funny because I have these moments where, I read a lot of thrillers, I read a lot of horror. For some reason, that's what calms me down. Anybody who listens to this podcast, I've said that a lot of times, and I make no apologies for it. This is what it is for me. But sometimes I get a lot of books, and I'm just like, okay, we're going to do interviews about these books. These all sound really good. And then there was an ARC of Cherish Farrah sitting in our break room. And I said, oh, this sounds really good. I'm going to read this, and I'll read it as a palate cleanser. And I was like, no, this is not right. I need to speak to this author and talk about this book. This is crazy. Yeah. And I love it when that happens, because it sort of, like you have your schedule of books that you're going to read, and then something creeps in and you just cannot stop thinking about it. And that was one of those books. This was certainly it.
Oh, I love that. I was very interested when you said it was going to be a palate cleanser. I was like, how did that work out? Because if there's anything I haven't heard it described as, it is a palate cleanser.
For me, it was great. But generally, my default is reading books that are going to mess me up. So if a book messes me up more than the other 5 books that just messed me up, that is a palate cleanser.
Right, yeah. I love that. That's amazing. I mean, I have really enjoyed people having such strong reactions. Honestly, in either direction, I've really enjoyed people having such visceral, strong reactions to it. It almost feels like vindication for how I was feeling when I was writing. Like the fact that I was so often just like all caps lock, texting Amy, I feel vindicated that other people seem to be having similar emotional outbursts about it. So
I'm sitting there reading this book and I'm like, oh, this is good. And then I'm like texting the cover to my friends. I'm like, whoa, I can't even describe what's happening here. This is
that's the other thing, is seeing a lot of Instagram posts of people who typically apparently do reviews. And it's not really a review, because it's just like all caps sentence fragments. And in the comments, people are like, are you going to tell me what the book is about? And she's like, no, I'm not actually. I don't know how to talk about this book. You have to read it. And I'm like, I take those as endorsements. I really appreciate those quote unquote reviews.
Oh, totally. For me, it's always like, oh my God, this is so messed up. You need to read this.
Yeah. I just saw Random House tweeted or posted on Instagram one of those things that's like, when book lovers' whole review is like, this destroyed me emotionally and mentally, you have to read it. Like, I want to share it with you. It devastated me, and now I have to share this with as many people as possible. I love that about us.
I feel like, though, coming out of this COVID world, which is not something we're really even coming out of. And also, but like, so much has happened, and, like, nothing that hasn't happened before, but also just being in your house and having a front row seat to so many things that you might have scrolled past because you're just like, I don't have time. I have too much going on. I think that's one of the reasons why I think reading horror and thrillers calms me down, and why this was sort of a palate cleanser. But I think that that is, why the idea of a book destroying you, very much like Cherish Farrah did in so many ways, has become a ringing endorsement, is because I think a lot of us are in many ways coming to reading from different places of being destroyed in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I spoke to Dr. Kanichor Brooks, who's a horror scholar, for my launch event with Cherish Farrah. I follow Tanana Reeve-Dew, who of course is a preeminent voice on horror, and especially Black use of horror and what horror affords us. And one of the things is it's curated trauma. It's cathartic trauma a lot of times. Because it's manufactured, and sometimes it can validate what you know to be real in your life, but there's also hopefully some sort of psychic distance. And that's why there's a difference between racist horror that's really actually just it's just more real world trauma. It doesn't handle it properly enough, and so it fails. But social horror, on the other hand, I think it almost sounds horrible, because it's you're being traumatized for real every single day, and increasingly so over the last couple of years, like you said. And then here's this thing where I'm going into it knowing what it's going to deal with, or at least how it might impact me. And this is such a fair thing to say, but there's an element of control to that. There is an element of an invitation of, let me process these really difficult feelings in a safe sort of fabricated way, versus the actual trauma that I'm constantly being bombarded with right now. And I think for a lot of people, that's what horror allows, right?
Yeah. You put it so well, because that's the only way I could describe it. Before we go, Farrah, wow. Where did she come from? Have you known people with her sort of way of being, or did she just kind of jump onto the page and say, hey, I'm in control of the story?
She kind of there's a unfortunately, or fortunately, honestly, but it's only unfortunate during interviews, but there's a way that writing, in so much as we can talk about, here's my writing procedure, and here's how I come up with characters, and here's how I think out, and here's how I plot, and here's how I blah blah. There's a part of it that we can never actually translate and sort of pass on to someone else, because it happens interiorly and in a way that is divine, in the sense that, well, in every sense, but in the sense that I'm talking about is that I don't know where it begins or ends. I don't, it's why I don't like questions like, who influenced you to be a writer when you were a kid? Because there's this assumption that everything is like a domino, whatever you call those things. I don't know. But everything is like these little
like the Rube Gold, is it the
models that it's assuming that our lives, our thoughts, everything about us is linear in that way. And first of all, I do think that for some of us, we come preset a certain way. First of all, I very much feel that I was born Bethany to a great degree, I think to a greater degree than is common. And I've said this repeatedly, and my parents have never disputed it. So take that for what it is. So there is an aspect where it's a question that starts from a framing that I don't feel is true to me or authentic to me. I have never personally needed an external engine in the first place. So I was a writer. I was writing when I was 7 years old. Nothing said, hey, you should do this. Nobody had to tell me it was even possible to do. It's something that I did. It'd be easier to talk about what did I gravitate to at different points, who did I gravitate to, and what validated me, which especially as a Black girl writing in the late 80s, early 90s, in elementary school, not a lot at the time. And if it was like I had to be reading about something that was past tense to have a Black character on the page, or it had to be dealing with enslavement or something around that time, or just, again, in the past, not the world that I was actually from, or it had to be a completely displaced Black girl in somebody else's story, and she didn't sound or look or she didn't represent me in any way, shape, or form, and she wasn't written by someone who looked like me. So there were times that I felt validated when I came across things, but I was already writing by these points, right? In the same sort of way, Farrah originated in herself. I did not set out. Firstly, I really did not set out to write Farrah, but I also didn't find her anywhere else. Now, as a former student of sociology, I realized that there are too many variables that we'll never be able to account for. And obviously the stew that I've been, that I've been in my entire life is going to have some impact, because culturally it would look different if I were from somewhere else. But she originated in herself. And I very much had to just allow her to inhabit that space. And it didn't matter to me if she looked like anybody I had seen before, or, and it was actually really important to me that she not be, because we usually have all these pop psychology archetypes that are really unnuanced and usually are pretty harmful to anybody who happens to share that diagnosis, which is another reason why she doesn't even have a diagnosis. But it should be really clear that she very organically is atypical. She is not a normal 17-year-old girl, but she absolutely is Farrah to me. I wouldn't be able to pick her apart and say like, oh, well, this looks like this, and this reminded me of this person. There are two things in this book, before we go, there are two things in this book that are semi-autobiographical. Number one is the stepping on the nails. I'm so sorry, neither of them are good.
I'm so sorry. Wow.
Yeah. So I used to, when my dad was renovating our house, he's a carpenter by trade, carpenter and a welder, and he used to do home improvements to my childhood home, pretty significant ones, large, big ones. And so we would have stuff on the side of the house sometimes. We would have kickboards and different things on the side of the house. I remember when he completely replaced all of the carpet in the house with hardwood flooring and stuff. And we just had we sometimes had this sort of detritus on the side of the house. And I decided to make this game of bending all of the nails. And I know that that my foot went into one of them, but I didn't tell anybody. But our younger neighbor of mine started doing it because I was doing it. And it was really traumatic. I just remember their dad having to like yank the thing off their foot while their mom was like holding them, because it was in there good. It was like really in his foot very well. The second thing is the liquid skin is also... For anybody being like, is that real? Yes, it is. Unfortunately, liquid skin is real, and it is the devil, and also it is extremely painful. So I rode a bike into the brick frontage of our garden when I was a kid, and it scraped all of the skin to like the bone on my shin. And for some reason, my mom was like, it was like the late 80s or something. My mom was like, we have to use liquid skin to make sure you don't get infected. And it's seared into my memory. It's one of my absolute worst childhood memories. So both of those are in the book. Yeah, that's the only thing, is like writing horror. I was like, oh, I can actually finally use some stuff from my life. The things that kids do, man.
Oh, wow. See, I believe that I was a child the same time as you, and liquid skin is not something I am familiar with. Whoa.
I remember telling people what had been done to me, because that's the way that I think about it, is like something was done to me. And people in my school being like, what are you talking about? I have no idea where my mom got this. I did make sure to look it up when I was older, and it was like, yep, it existed.
Yeah, was it one of those weird things that, like, your mind just sort of, no, that was real?
There's a couple of things, especially from like the late 80s. There's like, because I was born in 82, so I was really only in like first or second grade before the 90s. But there are these we had some really strange things that society as a whole just decided, I think, to abort really quickly. And because of it, I have these like memories that are pretty, pretty clear, but that if you ask 90% of people, they'll be like, that's not real. One of them actually was, I don't know if you've ever heard of Super Ted. There's a cartoon that I used to watch as a kid. We only watched on VHS. And my sisters and I absolutely loved this. Fast forward to like 2006, I'm living in Wales in the United Kingdom. And we go into the casualty, which is like the emergency room or whatever. And in front of we got directed to pediatrics, and in front of their pediatric wing is a huge statue of Super Ted, a character that everyone told me I made up that wasn't real. And the reason is because it was a freaking Welsh cartoon. Like, I don't know where my parents got these VHS.
Crazy. Wow. And now I'm like looking at Super Ted, and like John Pertwee was in it, and like all of these Victor Spinetti. I'm like looking at this now. I'm like, wow.
I should have put together. It was a thing. It was definitely a thing. I really should have put together that it was not an American cartoon, because the bad guy is a guy named Tex, who literally is from Texas and wears a cowboy hat.
Oh yeah, there's no way they would put that in an American cartoon.
Well, here's the problem. He talks like a British person thinks a Texan talks. So growing up in the United States and watching this, we were like, he's weird, but we thought it was just because he was a bad guy. It's like, no, right. It's because this was made overseas, and his whole personality is he's from Texas, and he has this super weird British pretend Texan accent. Anyway, so of all of the horror I have found that horror is a great place to take all of those strange memories that you have that may or may not have truly happened, according to everybody else, and just like, because they will now be able to haunt other people aside from myself, and I really appreciate that.
I appreciate it too. Although I'm really sorry that a lot of that happened to you, but everyone needs to read Cherish Farrah because it'll destroy you.
Yes, and then it will also vindicate me when you read it and have to deal with some of the two things that literally happened to me, and also just the way that I felt writing the book.
Thank you so much for sharing everything with us. Thank you for writing the book. I can't wait to see what comes next from you. This was a real good one, and I tell everybody to read it.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you guys enjoy reading Cherish Farrah.
This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My guest today was
Bethany C. Morrow.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.